I wasn't in a good place that winter, and being the priest did not keep me from knowing it. I was 43 years old, serving a mountain parish in western Washington where the fog sat low in the cedars, and the roads gave up early when ice came in sideways. Folks called me Father Brett, though half of them had known me as Brett Ford the millwright, long before I ever wore a collar. I still had millwright habits, still carried a flashlight in my coat pocket, still trusted a wrench more than a committee. I checked the chapel furnace lines myself every Saturday night, gloves off, fingers against steel, because hearing "we lost heat" from one of our older families at 2 a.m. was not something I could pray away after the fact. Practical work made sense to me. Grief did not. My younger brother, Nolan, died in March from an overdose in a rental 2 towns over, and I had not seen it coming. That sentence sat in me like wet concrete. I had preached 3 Sundays before his funeral and talked about grace in the clean language clergy are supposed to use, then stood at his graveside and felt no clean thing at all. Nolan wasn't a stranger I had met through parish outreach. He was my kid brother, 6 years younger, left-handed, laughed through his nose when he was trying not to laugh, could make a camp stove run with a piece of wire and a hard look. I knew his voice in a crowd. I knew the way he rubbed his thumbnail when he was lying. I did not know he was drowning. Or maybe I knew and chose easier explanations. That was the part that kept me up. By June, storm damage took out the county bridge at Miller's Cut, and that scattered half my congregation like geese after a shotgun blast. The North Side families could still get to the store and school with an extra 22 miles, but they couldn't risk that switchback on Sunday mornings once the weather turned. Attendance dropped from 42 on a decent week to 15 if the roads held. I stood in front of pews built for old logging crews and their families and listened to my own voice come back off the rafters like I was practicing for an empty building. People apologized when they called to say they couldn't make it. They sounded guilty and cold. I told them not to be foolish, that safety comes first, and meant it. Then I hung up and stared at the hymn board like it had done something personal to me. The chapel roof cracked along the east seam after the first hard November wind. Not a collapse, just enough damage that any solid rain pushed a fine line of water down behind the back wall. We moved the confessional chair and kneeler, then moved them again, then finally gave up and set a rough bench outside where the pine line started behind the fellowship hall. It felt strange at first, hearing confessions with damp needles underfoot and ravens shifting around above us. But the spot held a kind of privacy, and folks said they liked the open air. Their breath smoked in front of them when they talked. I sat in my heavy coat with my stole tucked under it, listening to people confess sharp words spoken in kitchens, small resentments, old regrets, ordinary failures that still mattered deeply to the person carrying them. I offered mercy in the same words I had always used. I could not locate it for myself. In my head, most mornings, the argument ran in present tense and it ran mean. You preach forgiveness and then hoard blame like winter feed. You tell widows God does not abandon them, then refuse to believe that for your own blood. You shake every hand after service and call it ministry, then drive home and sit in the truck, because going inside means hearing quiet. I had learned in millwright years that if a machine throws heat, there is friction somewhere. Find the friction, solve the problem. My soul did not present that cleanly. I could identify symptoms: short temper, poor sleep, jaw clamped hard enough to wake with headaches, an appetite that disappeared and returned in bad decisions. The cause sat there plain as daylight and still would not budge. Amos kept me more honest than prayer did those first months. He was an old red-tick hound with one torn ear and a chest like a barrel, and he had anxiety around strangers so pronounced that I joked he ought to wear my collar and warn people before they approached him. He wasn't mean, just worried. New boots on gravel made him pace. A truck door slamming on the far side of the lot sent him under my desk. He had been Nolan's dog before he was mine, which meant we were both inheriting what we could from a man no longer here to explain his choices. Amos slept on a faded quilt by the chapel stove and followed me room to room when I was at the rectory. If I stopped moving, he leaned against my knee and sighed like an old carpenter sitting down after roof work. There were nights when that steady weight was the only thing that kept me from driving nowhere for 2 hours, just to avoid my own thoughts. By the second week of November, rain had turned the church lane into a ribbon of mud with a crust of frost each morning, and the county started using the phrase active slide risk in every weather alert they sent. Folks up here had a darker name for it: Widowmaker Winter. Not because it killed in dramatic ways, though it sometimes did, but because it wore people down one failure at a time. A frozen pipe, a dead battery, a missed prescription pickup, a porch step slick enough to put an elder in a cast. You could lose a whole season to solving problems that had no villain and no audience. My parish skewed older, and I knew exactly which houses had fuel tanks running low, whose woodpile was too short, who would pretend they were fine until the house dropped below 52 degrees. I kept a paper list in my coat pocket and touched it like a rosary. On Wednesdays, I made rounds in my pickup with canned soup, bread, propane vouchers, and whatever pantry boxes we could assemble from donations that kept shrinking as roads worsened. Mrs. Hanley at the old Ranger duplex asked me to check her stovepipe draft and then tried to pay me in blackberry jam sealed 3 summers ago. I took the jam and left 2 extra blankets anyway. The Boudreaux sisters, Irene and May, lived beyond a narrow footbridge over Cedar Run, where the current looked polite, right up until it wasn't. I inspected their bridge planks with the same suspicion I gave conveyor belts in my old trade: heel pressure, visual line, listening for a weak complaint in the wood. They offered me coffee boiled strong enough to float a horseshoe. We sat in their warm kitchen while sleet tapped the windows and talked about practical things: insulin deliveries, boots, church candles, whether ravens were getting bolder. Every conversation ended with some version of, "You stay safe on that road, Father." I said I would. Then I drove away and wondered how long the road would keep that promise. The church council wanted me to cut services to every other week until the bridge reopened. Their argument was reasonable, and I hated it. We met around a folding table in the fellowship hall with a space heater clicking in the corner and wet coats steaming on chairbacks. "We can stream a message," Dale Mercer said, rubbing his palms over his jeans. "Folks can watch from home and not risk the pass." Dale chaired finance and thought in sensible columns. "You can't pastor from a ditch," he added. He wasn't wrong. I looked at the attendance sheets, looked at the fuel bill, looked at 12 coffee cups ringed on a plywood table, and thought how quickly necessity can feel like surrender. "We keep Sundays," I said finally. "Even if it's 6 people and a dog, we keep a door open somewhere warm." Nobody argued hard after that. They just nodded with the tired faces of people already carrying too much. There was a kind of embarrassment in how much I needed that door open. Priests are supposed to be steady, and I had always done competent steady very well. I could write a homily on little sleep, answer a hospital call in the middle of dinner, organize volunteers by weather window and pickup capacity. I could baptize a baby with frozen fingers and then crawl under the hall sink to fix a leak before potluck. But after Nolan died, competence became a shell game. I kept all the motions and none of the ease. Once, after Saturday vigil, I caught my reflection in the sacristy window and saw a man who looked assembled by habit. Eyes rimmed red, shoulders up by his ears, mouth set like he was bracing for impact. I stood there long enough for Amos to nudge my calf twice, and when I looked down at him, he gave me that old hound expression that says, "Both are you coming? And what are we doing?" Exactly. The first Sunday we held confessions at the Pine Line, fog threaded between the trunks in pale bands, and the world smelled like wet bark, wool and wood smoke from someone's stove down the valley. We had 11 in attendance, counting Dale's grandson who came for the donuts and stayed for the songs. After service, I carried the stool and little side table outside, set them on level ground and waited as folks came one by one. Boots on needles, hands wrapped around coat cuffs, quiet truths offered in cold air. Amos lay near my feet at first, then rose halfway through and turned toward one specific stand of cedar about 40 yards out. He sat down facing it, very straight, ears up, no trembling, no warning growl, no pacing. Calm as I had ever seen him around anything unfamiliar. He watched that spot until the last person left. Then he came back and pressed his shoulder against my shin, steady and warm. I remember laying a hand on his head and feeling, for the first time in months, not fixed, not redeemed, but fractionally less alone. I kept my hand on Amos's head until my fingers went numb from the cold, and he finally shook himself, tags clicking against his collar, then looked up at me like he was waiting for the next instruction. There wasn't one. The lot was empty except for my truck and Dale's old Subaru, and when Dale backed out, he gave me a little wave through the windshield and kept going, careful over the ruts. After the taillights disappeared around the bend, the hush settled in so completely it felt like a blanket pulled over furniture. I gathered the stool, the little side table, and the folded wool blanket I used for older knees, then set them inside the fellowship hall door and stood there with my coat half unzipped, listening. Drip from the eaves, a branch rubbing the gutter in slow strokes, Amos breathing behind me. No ravens. They were usually loud this close to dusk, arguing with each other from the highest pines like old men in a feed store. That evening, there was nothing from them at all. I told myself silence in winter meant weather. Snow coming, pressure dropping, birds sheltering. I told myself a lot of practical things in those months, and most of them were true enough to function. None of them reached the ache. I locked the hall, checked the thermostat inside the chapel, checked the furnace pressure gauge with my flashlight, and tapped the copper line with my knuckle out of old habit. Solid, warm, serviceable. My life had narrowed to serviceable. Back in the rectory kitchen, I heated leftover stew and ate half of it standing at the counter while Amos watched with serious interest. Nolan used to tease me for that. Said I ate like a man waiting for a whistle to blow. I caught myself smiling at the memory, and then just as quickly set the spoon down because the smile hurt worse than the heaviness. Grief was odd that way. It didn't always strike at the worst moment. Sometimes it waited until you were holding something ordinary and then put all its weight on your chest at once. I took my bowl to the sink, ran water over it, and stared out the small window above the faucet. Beyond the yard, the pine line was already black against the little bit of sky left, and fog moved through the trunks in strips. Amos had gone to the mudroom door and stood there without whining, just looking at me over his shoulder. He wanted outside. We went. The cold had sharpened by then, the kind that made each breath feel clean and thin in your nose. I walked him to the edge of the clearing with a flashlight in one hand and my collar tucked under my coat, because I hated how the wind found my neck. Amos did his slow loop, sniffed along the split rail fence, then stopped at the same direction he had watched from confessions. He sat again, straight-backed, ears forward, but not tense. Not hunting, not warning, waiting. "Well," I said quietly, because saying nothing at all felt stranger. "If you see someone, At least invite them to help stack wood. It was a poor joke, but I heard my own voice and almost laughed at how tired I sounded. Amos glanced at me, then returned his attention to the cedars like he had an appointment I wasn't qualified to attend. I stood there beside him long enough for my boots to soak through at the seams. My thoughts turned, as they always did in stillness, toward Nolan and that last winter before he died, toward the calls I missed because I was in meetings, toward the messages I answered with priestly confidence and brotherly delay. I had absolved strangers for less than what I held against myself. In that dark, with no parishioner in front of me and no liturgy to hide behind, I prayed badly and plain. I said, I can't keep doing this numb. Into the trees, barely above a whisper. I can work, I can show up. I can't keep pretending that's the same as being alive. My breath smoked in the beam of the flashlight. Nothing answered. I didn't expect anything to answer. Still, speaking it out loud shifted something in me. Not relief exactly, more like moving a heavy box an inch and proving it could move. Amos stood, touched his shoulder to my knee and turned back toward the house. I followed him in, dried his paws with an old towel and sat at the kitchen table with the paper list of parish needs in front of me. I added 2 lines in block letters. Hanley, more split wood. Boudreaux Bridge, check again. Then I stared at the pen until the ink blotted on the page. 3 days later, rain came in hard from the west and kept at it through the night, drumming on the patched roof and rattling the vent hood over my stove. I slept in scraps, woke before dawn with my jaw locked, and went outside to clear the chapel steps before anyone arrived for weekday prayer. Mud had crept over the lower edge of the walk like something patient. The creek sounded fuller from down the slope. Widowmaker winter never rushed. It just kept leaning until something gave. By the second Sunday after we moved confessions outside, the ground behind the fellowship hall had gone from soft to slick, and I put down old feed sacks under the bench legs so nobody slid while kneeling. Attendance was 9. We sang without accompaniment because our pianist called from her driveway to say the truck wouldn't start. The little sanctuary held the sound anyway, thin but sincere, and for 40 minutes I forgot to count what we had lost. After service, I carried the stool back to the pine line. Amos came with me and lay down near my right boot. Again, halfway through confessions, he rose and turned toward that stand of cedar. Same posture, same calm certainty. Mrs. Hanley followed his gaze when she stepped away from the bench, then looked at me. "He fixed on that patch again," she said, rubbing gloved hands together. "You got elk bedding close?" "Not that I've seen." She watched another moment, then smiled with that weathered kindness she always had. "He knows more than we do most days." "That's been true for years," I said. She chuckled and headed to her Buick. We both left it there. That night, with sleet ticking against the windows, I walked the fence line with a headlamp and found nothing unusual besides old tracks blurred by thaw and freeze. No boot prints, no torn bark, no sign of trespassers, prankers, hunters, or curious teenagers from town with too much time and cheap gear. Amos ranged a little ahead of me and never once bristled. He moved as if we were sharing the property with something he trusted. I should say plainly that I was not looking for wonder then. I was looking for causes. Loose latch, shifted branch, deer corridor. Anything I could circle in red and assign a fix. That was my language. The unknown had never felt holy to me. It felt like deferred maintenance. The third Sunday came in with low fog and a brittle crust over the mud. My fingers burned inside my gloves while I set out the bench and stool. Folks arrived in 2s and 3s, cheeks red from cold, breath white in front of them. I heard confessions for almost an hour and a half, longer than usual, because winter pressed on people's tempers and fears. A man confessed he had stopped checking on his neighbour after an argument over a property line. A young mother confessed she'd yelled at her son until he cried because she was scared about heating bills and took it out on the nearest heart. I listened, offered counsel, assigned small penances that pointed toward repair. I could do that work in my sleep. It mattered anyway. When the last person left, I sat for a minute, with my hands on my knees and Amos leaning against my shin. The fog had thinned enough that shafts of pale light reached the ground between trunks. I heard one limb snap far back in the trees, deliberate and measured, then silence again. Not the crash of an animal blundering through brush. One clean break, then stillness. Amos lifted his head, watching the cedar stand. His tail gave one slow sweep against the needles. "All right," I muttered, half to him and half to my own nerves. "If you're calm, I'm calm." I stood and turned to carry the stool back, and that was when I saw the stones. 2 smooth river stones, each about the size of my palm, lay on the ground beside the confessional stool in a careful cross. Not tossed, placed. One horizontal, one vertical, centered with a precision I would have admired in a mill alignment. The stones were wet but clean, as if recently rinsed. There was no fresh print around them that I could find, not human, not boot tread, not obvious paw marks in the crusted mud. I knelt to touch one, and it was colder than the air. My pulse bumped hard once in my throat. I looked up at the tree line, saw only trunks and shadow and fog lifting in white threads. Amos stepped forward, sniffed near the stones, and then sat down beside me with his whole body loose, almost content. I stayed there longer than made sense, trying explanations in sequence like parts on a bench. Kid from town playing games. Maybe. But why this, and why here, and why no tracks? A parishioner trying to comfort me, maybe knowing I was frayed. Also possible, except nobody had passed close enough after confessions without me noticing, and these stones weren't from our lot gravel. River-smoothed, dark grey, carried in from somewhere lower. The longer I looked, the less it felt like a trick, and the more it felt like a gesture from someone who understood where to put their hands so as not to startle a wounded animal. Respectful distance, no demand attached. I picked the cross up carefully and set the stones on the little side table, intending to mention them to Dale, then changed my mind and placed them back exactly as I found them. That felt important for reasons I couldn't defend. Amos gave a small huff as if approving the decision. I scanned the cedar stand one more time and, against my own sense of dignity, whispered, "Thank you," toward empty trees and felt ridiculous for a full minute. Then I laughed once under my breath at myself, because there I was, an ordained man with a practical trade background, thanking fog and timber like I'd lost my bearings entirely. By Tuesday morning, after a night of freezing rain that glazed every branch and power line in a skin of glass, I stepped out to check the woodpile and stopped short. On top of the split log stack beside the rectory wall sat a small bunch of late-season asters tied with a thin strand of grass, petals pale violet against the brown bark. No vase, no note, no prints I could trust in the crusted ground. Just flowers where flowers had no business surviving that week. Amos walked up, sniffed them gently, then looked toward the pines and wagged his tail once, slow and sure. I stood with an armload of kindling and felt the morning open around me in a way I hadn't felt since before Nolan died. Not because I understood anything, but because for the first time in a long while I could imagine that mercy might arrive without asking permission from my logic first. I set the kindling down on the porch step and stood there with my gloves tucked under one arm, looking at those asters until cold worked through my socks. The petals were bruised at the edges from frost, but they were still whole, still arranged with care. Stems evened out as neatly as if someone had laid them against a ruler. My first thought was practical and unkind. Somebody was messing with me. My second thought was worse. Maybe I was starting to see meaning where there was none because grief had finally worn me thin. Amos sat beside me, tail resting on the boards, his eyes on the flowers and then on me, patient as a nurse waiting for a stubborn man to take his medicine. I carried the asters inside and put them in an old jelly jar by the sink. Then I pulled a spiral notebook from the junk drawer, the kind we used for pantry inventory, and wrote at the top in block letters, "Pine Line Notes." It felt foolish, and also necessary. Millwright habit again. If a machine behaved strange, you logged when, where, temperature, vibration, load. Pattern first, opinion later. I wrote down the stones, then the flowers, then weather and time and where Amos had been standing. I added, in smaller letters, no clear tracks. I stared at that line a long minute and then wrote another one under it. No sense of threat. That afternoon I drove to the Boudreau sisters with 2 pantry boxes, a sack of dog food they swore they didn't need and clearly did, and a bundle of split order for their mudroom rack. Their bridge creaked in 3 places and dipped at the centre, half-inch more than last week. I crossed slow, listening to each plank complain. Irene held the door with her cane and May waved me in from the stove. "You look like you slept in your boots," May said, setting out a chipped mug. "Only because my bed keeps rejecting me," I said. Irene snorted. "Bed's got standards, father." We laughed, and it helped. I checked their propane gauge, taped plastic over a drafty back window, and left with a grocery list folded in my pocket. As I stepped off the bridge, I turned and told them, "If that creek rises another 6 inches, you call me before dark. No heroics." May lifted a hand. "We call, you don't speed." Deal. By the end of that week, I had 3 more entries in the notebook. Thursday, stillness near dawn, ravens quiet 15 minutes, then 1 clean limb snap from cedar stand. Amos calm. Friday, found kindling stacked under tarp behind Fellowship Hall, dry despite freezing rain, not done by me or council crew. Saturday, same cedar-facing posture from Amos during evening round, no pacing, no bark. I wrote each line like I was afraid adjectives might contaminate evidence. Then, because honesty mattered more than control, I wrote 1 private line across the bottom margin. Curiosity sat where grief usually sat, and I didn't resent it. Sunday came with sleet that stung your cheeks and turned the gravel lot to marbles. Attendance was 8 and a toddler in a dinosaur hat who sang 1 hymn syllable behind everyone else with complete confidence. I preached from Micah about doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly, and heard myself speaking like a man trying to climb back into his own skin. After service, I set up at the Pine Line again. Breath, needles, wool, wood smoke from the rectory flue. One by one, people came and went, boots crunching the crusted ground. When Dale Mercer finished, he lingered instead of heading straight to his car. He was a broad man with a mechanic's hands and a way of chewing his lower lip when he wanted to disagree respectfully. "You're keeping notes now?" he asked, nodding toward the notebook tucked under my arm. "I am." "On what exactly?" I hesitated, then gave him the version I could stand behind. "Odd things around the property, stones placed by the bench, flowers where they shouldn't be, dry kindling under tarp after the ice." Dale looked past me to the cedars, then back. "Could be somebody helping quiet." "Could be." He shifted his weight. "You sleeping any better?" "No." He gave me a long look that held concern without pity. "Don't run yourself into the ground proving a point to weather, Brett." I almost said there was no point to prove. Instead, I said, "I know." He nodded once, squeezed my shoulder, and left. I sat for another 20 minutes after everyone was gone, not hearing confessions anymore, just speaking some of my own out loud to cold air because the words needed somewhere to land. I told the trees I was tired of carrying Nolan like a verdict. I told them I was angry at him, angry at myself, angry at a spring afternoon that ended in a phone call I still replayed in exact detail. Amos stayed pressed against my leg and watched the cedar stand with soft eyes. Twice I heard movement out there, heavy enough to be substantial, careful enough to be intentional. No brush crashing, no panic, just weight placed and withdrawn. On Tuesday, freezing rain coated every branch in clear glass and left the parish road shining like polished steel. I was out early with a shovel chopping drainage channels through slush when I found another kindness. Under the tarp by the fellowship hall, where I had left a sloppy pile of mixed scraps and damp splits, someone had sorted and stacked clean kindling by size. Bark side out, dry centres protected, enough to start a dozen stoves. The stack was better than mine, square and tight, with just enough gap for airflow. I squatted there in wet gloves and laughed once, short and disbelieving. "Either I've got a saint with a lumberyard brain," I said to Amos, "or I'm being graded by a woodsman I can't see." Amos wagged and sneezed. I looked for tracks, and again there was little worth trusting. Ice had glazed and thawed and glazed blurring edges. But along the mud fringe near the cedar side, I found one depression deeper than the rest. Not a print I could cast, just a broad oval sink in the ground where weight had pressed down and lifted clean. I put my boot beside it. My size 11 sat inside the margin with room to spare. I closed the notebook without writing for a while. 3 days passed before I mentioned any of this outside church. I was fueling up at Carter's store where folks bought milk, chainsaw files, and rumours in equal measure. Walt Givens, old logger with shoulders like a porch beam and a face carved by weather, stood by the coffee station in a waxed canvas jacket that had outlived several presidents and one marriage. He watched me pour burnt coffee into a paper cup and said, "You look like a man hearing footsteps he can't count." That obvious? To anybody who spent time under trees. I took a breath. You ever know of someone leaving things? Helpful things. Quiet. Walt kept his eyes on the rain blowing sideways past the window. Out here, you don't always see who shares the load. I waited. He tipped his cup toward the dark line of ridge beyond the pumps. Some things out here listen better than people. That was all he gave me. No grin, no performance, no campfire embellishment, just a sentence set down plain as an axe. I thanked him and left, coffee cooling in my hand. By the second week of December, my notebook had become part weather log, part confession, part argument with myself. One page read, "prank," and listed reasons. Next page read, "bear," and listed counterpoints. Bears do not tie asters with grass strands. Bears do not sort kindling by length. Amos never once showed alarm. No claw marks on structures. Movement patterns too deliberate near saplings. On the third page, I wrote what I had been refusing to write. I told myself, this couldn't be real, but nothing in me felt hunted. I underlined hunted twice and shut the notebook like it might bite. The first glimpse came on a Thursday evening as light was draining out of the valley, and the sky held that iron blue colour right before full dark. I had run late at the Hanleys fixing a stubborn flue damper and drove back with Amos in the passenger seat, both of us smelling like creosote and wet wool. Instead of turning straight into the rectory drive, I parked near the backfield where the old logging spur cut through ferns and second-growth cedar. Something in me wanted to walk the edge one more time before snow sealed it. Mist lay low over the fern brake, silvering in the last light. Every sound carried strangely far. Drip off a snag, creak mutter below, my own boots sucking free of mud. Amos moved ahead 10 yards, then stopped and looked right. Not stiff, just attentive. I followed his gaze across the open strip toward the tree line opposite us. At first I saw nothing but trunks and shadow. Then one shadow separated itself and moved. He was farther than I could have thrown a stone, maybe 70 yards, partly screened by cedar boughs, but scale announced itself immediately. Height somewhere around 8 or 9 feet, shoulders broad enough to make surrounding trunks look thin, dark fur taking the last light as matte brown-black rather than true black. What struck me first, even before size, was control. He stepped between young saplings without brushing them, placed each foot with measured care on root and stone, and paused when Amos paused, as if we were all sharing the same fragile floor. I should have felt panic. I had every cultural script for panic ready in my bones. Instead, I felt a clean, steady jolt of awe and a strange tenderness that made no sense. He did not square up, did not close distance, did not posture. He turned slightly sideways, reducing his outline, then lowered his head a fraction in a motion that read to me as deference, almost courtesy. The gesture was so unexpected I forgot to breathe for a count. Amos sat down in wet ferns and thumped his tail once. I stood with my gloves in one hand and my flashlight dead at my side, because I could not imagine pointing a beam at him like an accusation. My thoughts ran fast and plain. This is happening. This is not a stump. This is not fatigue. Stay still. Don't crowd him. Don't make this into fear because you are used to fear. My chest hurt with it, not from terror, from the pressure of recognizing something I had no category for except presence. He watched us with eyes that caught the low light, amber brown, calm and focused. Not vacant, not wild. Aware in the way old craftsmen are aware of every tool on a bench. He shifted his weight once and I heard a soft exhale carry across the damp air, deep in the chest, but gentle, like a bass string brushed rather than struck. Then he took 2 backward steps, careful as before, and let the cedars gather him back into shadow. No theatrics, no rush, just withdrawal. I stayed where I was until my legs started shaking from cold. Amos rose, walked to me and leaned into my thigh so hard I had to widen my stance. I set my hand on his back and realized I was crying, quiet and surprised, tears running cold along my jaw into my beard. I wasn't crying because I was frightened. I was crying because for a few suspended minutes, the world had held a kindness bigger than my understanding and had not asked me to earn it first. When I could trust my voice, I said into the trees, "I see you." It sounded small and true. Back in the kitchen, I dried Amos with 2 towels, fed him early, and sat at the table with the notebook open to a clean page. My handwriting wobbled at first, then steadied. Date, time, weather, location, estimated distance, movement details, posture, Amos' response. I wrote until the pen dented the paper. At the bottom, I added 1 line I did not plan. If Mercy can stand in the tree line and keep respectful distance, maybe I can learn to receive it without argument. I set the notebook beside the jelly jar of fading asters and listened to sleet begin again on the window, each tap sharp and quick. Widowmaker winter was still out there doing what it does, leaning on roofs and roads and old bones. But that night, for the first time since March, I felt the lean ease by a measure I could feel in my ribs. I slept 4 straight hours, woke before dawn, and did not dread the dark between the pines. I brewed coffee before sunrise and drank it on the back step with Amos pressed against my shin. both of us watching the fog unthread itself from the cedar trunks as the sky lightened from iron to pearl. My notebook sat open on my knee, yesterday's ink dry and final, and for once I did not feel like I was building a case against myself. I felt like I was waiting for a familiar knock, when I walked the pine line that morning, I did it without a flashlight. Frost had stiffened the needles, and each step made a small, brittle whisper. Near the confessional bench, where mud and thaw usually erased every edge by noon, I found 3 broad impressions in the ground, each one longer than my forearm from wrist to elbow, heel deep, toe spread subtle but clear. Not perfect prints, not courtroom material, but enough to hold shape before the sun softened them. I stood over them and set my boot beside one, then shook my head at the uselessness of comparison. I took 2 photos anyway and texted them to Warden Klein, because practical men still make practical calls even when wonder has started making room at the table. He wrote back 40 minutes later. Hard to tell scale from image. Melt can distort. Could be black bear with slide. Keep distance. Standard answer, fair answer. No malice in it. I typed thanks, will do, and put my phone away. The old part of me wanted that message to settle everything. The rest of me knew it settled nothing. By Wednesday, the pantry shelves had more gaps than cans. Dale and I stood in the fellowship hall counting beans, rice, powdered milk, and the last 3 propane vouchers while sleet tapped the windows in sharp little bursts. He ran a hand over his beard and said, "If the pass closes this weekend, we're going to have folks stretching soup with hot water." I know. He looked at me, then at the notebook on the table. "You still hearing things out there?" "Sometimes." He nodded slowly, like he was choosing words that could carry concern without sounding like correction. "If it keeps you steady, I won't argue with steady. But if you start feeling spun up, you call me, day or night." "I will." He snorted softly. "You won't. But say it anyway." "I will." That got half a smile out of him. We packed 12 boxes with what we had, wrote names in marker and stacked them by the mudroom door. Amos watched us from his quilt by the stove, ears twitching each time wind rattled the vent pipe. Sunday arrived under low cloud and a cold that felt metallic in the lungs. We had 7 in service, plus Dale's grandson again, still 1 beat behind the hymns, and proud of it. I preached short because people needed road time more than extra commentary, then carried the stool and side table to the pine line, set the blanket, and waited. Confessions came slow, then stopped. Last truck left. Sound dropped. I stayed seated on the bench with my hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, gone lukewarm, looking at the cedar stand where Amos had been watching for weeks. He was there now, 10 feet to my right, sitting straight, tail still, easy in his body, not guarding, expecting. I spoke aloud because silence had become less empty out there. "For whoever's listening," I said, feeling foolish and steady at once, "we're running low on pantry food. Roads may close by Tuesday. I can handle what I can handle." Wind moved high in the branches and never touched us at ground level. I listened to my own breathing, to the creek mutter down the slope, to one raven passing overhead and giving a single dry croak before disappearing into fog. Then it came, low and resonant from the cedars, one chest-deep tone that held for 2 seconds and faded. Not speech, not a bark, not any call I knew from elk, bear, owl, or anything I had heard in 43 years of living around timber. It sounded like a bowed bass note pulled through wood. My skin went cold along my arms under the coat, not from fear, from recognition that my categories had run out. Amos did not flinch. He lowered his head slightly and kept staring at the tree line. I sat very still and let my thoughts run without trying to pin them down. This is real enough to hear. This is real enough to answer. You are not being hunted. You are being accompanied. I had spent months braced for punishment from weather, from memory, from God, from my own conscience. The tone from the trees held none of that. It held presence, attention, a kind of gravity without threat. 2 deer stepped out of the brush, 30 yards left of the cedar stand, a doe and last spring's fawn, thin but calm. They lowered their heads and fed on exposed grass near the edge of the clearing, ears rotating, bodies loose, not showing the hard alert posture they carried around coyotes or strange dogs. The doe lifted her head once toward the cedars, blinked, and returned to feeding. Whatever stood in that line of trees, the deer accepted it as part of the morning. I laughed once under my breath, quiet and helpless. "All right," I whispered. "If the deer aren't filing a complaint, I won't either." There was movement then, slight and deliberate, a dark shape shifting between trunks at the edge of visibility. I saw shoulder first, then the curve of a head, then the long line of one arm hanging easy at its side. He stayed mostly screened by cedar boughs, but I could read scale by relation to the trees I knew. Enormous, balanced, still. I put the cup down on the bench, and without thinking too hard about it, touched 2 fingers to my collar at my throat in an old reflex from before Mass. "Peace to you," I said toward the trees. He did not step closer. He did not retreat. After a long moment, he lowered his head by a fraction in that same careful gesture I had seen at the fern break, then shifted his weight back to give more distance, as if he understood exactly how much space I needed to stay calm. That courtesy undid me in a new way. Fear asks nothing about your limits. Kindness does. By the second week of December's final stretch, ice rain started before dusk and hardened every surface by midnight. I made 2 emergency calls, one to Miss Hanley about a furnace reset, one to the Boudreaux sisters to tell them not to cross their bridge for any reason until daylight. Both answered on the 3rd ring, both sounded tired and game, and both promised to stay put. I slept in my clothes again with boots by the bed and woke at 2:17 to Amos whining at the mudroom door. Outside, the world had turned to glass. Porchboards shone. Fence wire hummed faintly in the wind. Amos did his business quick, then trotted toward the split-rail fence and stopped short, with one paw lifted, ears forward. I called him back. He hesitated, took 2 steps and yelped once, sharp and startled, then disappeared off the path into the darker strip near the cedars. I went after him with a headlamp and a rope from the shed, sliding more than walking, muttering his name through clenched teeth. "Amos, easy, come on, buddy, answer me." I heard him whine again from somewhere low near the old logging spur, followed by a soft, heavy shift of brush that was too controlled to be panic. My heart climbed into my throat. When my light found them, I stopped where I was. Amos stood with his rear legs braced, and his front right paw caught in a loop of rusted snare wire, half buried under leaves and ice. Probably old and forgotten from decades back, now pulled tight where he'd struggled. Beside him, crouched to make himself smaller, was the one I had been meeting at distance for weeks. One massive hand steadied Amos's shoulder without pressing. The other worked the wire with careful, patient turns, lifting and widening the loop so it would clear fur and pad without tearing skin. Amos trembled but did not snap, did not try to bolt. He leaned into that steady hand the way he leaned into my knee by the stove. I stood there with my rope slack in one hand and tears already coming before I had permission to cry. He looked up once, amber-brown eyes catching my lamp's edge, and held my gaze in a way that felt less like warning and more like instruction. Stay calm, stay back, let me finish. I nodded before I realized I was nodding. You're all right, I said to Amos, voice shaking. You're all right, old man. We've got you. The wire came free. He lifted Amos's paw clear and set it down gently on stable ground, then shifted backward 2 deliberate steps to give us room. Amos limped to me and pressed hard against my legs, shivering from cold and relief. I knelt on the ice, checked the paw with numb fingers. Red groove, no deep cut, no torn pad, no break. We were lucky by inches. When I looked up again, he had moved to the side of the path near a fallen cedar, broad body half in shadow, posture neutral and unhurried. He waited while I wrapped Amos's paw with gauze from my pocket kit and tied it clumsy in the cold. Then he turned his attention to the wire trap on the ground, lifted it, and twisted until the old metal snapped at 2 weak points. He carried the broken lengths to a stump and set them high out of reach, where no animal could step into them again. Deliberate, unmistakable. Aimed straight at what I loved. Thank you, I said, and this time I did not whisper it like an apology. I said it with my whole chest. Thank you for him. He stayed a few seconds longer, watching to make sure Amos could bear weight. Then he gave that small, lowered head gesture again, turned, and moved between the cedars with the same measured control, stepping around young saplings as if each one mattered. In 3 breaths he was part of the trees again. I got Amos inside, dried him, warmed broth, and sat on the kitchen floor with him until his shaking stopped. He slept with his head on my boot while sleet clicked against the window and the stove ticked as it cooled. I wrote the incident in the notebook at 3:41 a.m. Every detail I could trust. Location, wire type, injury minor. Intervention observed at close range, no aggression, clear protective intent. Then I put the pen down and rested my hand on Amos's ribs, counting each breath. At dawn I went back with bolt cutters and a shovel, found the broken snare where he had left it on the stump, and cleared the whole stretch of old wire and scrap metal along that spur. 2 feed sacks full by the time light reached the chapel roof. I logged the hazard removal and called Warden Klein again, gave coordinates and asked for a wider sweep when roads allowed. He thanked me and said they'd add it to the backlog after the storm cycle. That was enough. When Sunday came, I carried 1 smooth riverstone from the first cross and set it on the confessional side table beside my stole, not as proof for anybody else, as gratitude with weight to it. Amos lay at my feet with his paw nearly healed, and when we both looked toward the cedars, I no longer felt like I was waiting for the unknown. I felt like I was keeping company with a mercy I had finally stopped arguing against. I kept one hand on that stone through the last confession, thumb resting in the worn dip at its center, while Mrs. Hanley spoke in a low voice about snapping at her sister on the phone and feeling meaner than she wanted to be. I listened, offered her a small penance and a blessing, and watched her shoulders loosen under her coat when she stood. Amos stayed stretched along my boots, healed paw tucked neatly, eyes half closed but ears tuned toward the cedar stand. When the lot emptied and engine sounds faded down the lane, I sat alone on the bench with my stole under my jacket, cold working through the seat of my jeans, and tried to pray without performing it. The pines held their own silence, and it wasn't empty anymore. By late afternoon, the sky had dropped into that flat grey that means freezing rain is not a possibility, but a decision already made. I carried the stool and blanket inside, checked the furnace lines, topped off the stove box, and had just set soup on the burner when the rectory phone rang. May Boudreau was breathless but steady. "Father, you on the road?" "Not yet. What's going on?" Irene took a spill in the mudroom, Didn't break anything, I don't think, but she's got that scared look. Keeps saying she wants prayer now, not later. Creak's up. Bridge is bad. I'm coming. Don't bring that old hound on this ice. I looked down at Amos, already standing at the door with purpose written in his whole body. I'll make bad decisions in small ways, May. Big ways, I'm still careful. Keep her warm. I'm 25 out. I called Dale next, told him where I was headed and asked if he could stage near the church lane with tow straps in case I got stuck. He gave me one irritated exhale that meant yes before the sentence ended. External contacts made, practical boxes checked. Then Amos and I were on the road, wipers slapping sleet, heater losing the fight, headlights turning the storm into bright needles. At the sister's place, Irene was upright in her chair with a wrapped ankle, pale but dry-eyed, one hand gripping her rosary so hard the beads had marked her skin. I anointed her, prayed with both sisters, checked the ankle again, and made them promise they would not cross that footbridge for any reason until daylight and backup. They argued exactly once and then surrendered with the grace of people who knew stubbornness had limits. May pressed a jar of canned peaches into my hand on the way out because she never let anyone leave empty. I set it back on her counter and told her to feed Irene instead. When Amos and I started back, the storm had thickened into glassy rain that sealed branches and turned every rut into a shallow skating lane. Halfway down the slope towards Cedar Run, I saw two figures by the failed culvert where the logging spur met the old footbridge approach. Dale Mercer and Mrs. Hanley, both waving both arms in the wash of my headlights. Dale's Subaru sat crooked with one wheel sunk to the hub. They had tried to move pantry boxes from his car to her truck before the road sealed up, and now neither vehicle could safely back out. I cut the engine and stepped into noise, creek roaring harder than it had any right to roar in December, sleet ticking on my hood, tree limbs cracking in the distance under ice load. The footbridge to the sister's side had lost one support at the near bank and was sagging into a hard diagonal over black, fast water. You could cross it once if you were lucky and light. You could die trying if luck ran out. We were just trying to get boxes up the hill, Mrs. Hanley said, voice thin with cold and embarrassment. Then the bridge shifted and I about went with it. Dale pointed with his chin. We can't leave the food, can't leave the cars, can't cross as is. We need a stable path now or we wait here till morning and freeze stupid. I started laying out options out loud, mechanic style, because naming steps calmed me. We rope from that alder to the Subaru frame, keep 3 points of contact, move people first, supplies second. Amos paced beside my legs, nose high, then broke right toward the bridge approach before I could catch his collar. His back paws hit a skim of ice over mud, and he slid downhill in one quick, helpless motion toward the collapsed edge. Amos! I went after him, boots skating, one knee slamming hard into frozen ground. He scrambled, found no purchase, and slid another foot toward the water. The cedar line to our left opened without hurry. He stepped out in full view, broad as a shed door and dark against the sleet, moving straight to Amos with the same deliberate calm I had seen in the snare incident and the fern break and every half-glimpsed moment in between. One massive hand cupped Amos's chest, the other steadied his hindquarters, and he lifted my old hound as gently as if he were lifting a sleeping child from a couch. He carried him 3 strides uphill and set him against my shins. Amos leaned into me shaking, then turned and pressed his muzzle against that huge wrist, once, brief and trusting. Dale made a sound I had never heard from him, not fear so much as disbelief, stripped bare. Mrs. Hanley whispered, "Lord, have mercy," and crossed herself with a hand that trembled. He did not look at them first. He looked at me, then at the bridge, then at the deadfall trunks stacked along the bank from last spring's blowdown. He moved to those trunks and began working with methodical force, lifting, pivoting, wedging heavy lengths crosswise against the failing support points, building a rough stabilizer crib where the bridge met the bank. No wasted motion, no display. Engineering by instinct and strength. I stood there, soaked and stunned, then snapped back into my body and joined where I could, shoving smaller poles, pulling rope, following his placement cues like I used to follow foreman hand signals above a conveyor line. 3 minutes of work changed the geometry. The bridge still sagged, but it stopped shifting under load. "Dale, you first across with the line," I said. My voice sounded wrecked and clear at once. Hanley second, clipped to the rope, slow feet, eyes on me. "What about you?" Dale asked. "I'm last." He hesitated only one beat, then did exactly what I said. He crossed crouched and careful, clipped the rope on the far side around a cedar base. Misses. Hanley crossed next, whispering prayers in rhythm with each step. I followed with Amos in my arms, his weight awkward and welcome, my boots feeling for each plank while black water shoved at broken timber below us. We made it across, all three of us. Pantry boxes too, ferried hand to hand in 2 trips, once human bodies were safe. When I turned back, he was standing on the near bank in sleet, one arm resting lightly against a trunk he had just set, posture easy, eyes steady on us to confirm we were clear. That was the moment the held thing in me finally gave way. I set Amos down, leaned both hands on my knees, and cried like a man who had spent 9 months trying not to. Not neat tears. Full body grief and relief together. Breath catching. Words dragged up raw. "I couldn't save him," I said across the water, not caring who heard now. "I couldn't save Nolan, and I have been preaching from numbness like it was faith. I kept thinking work could pay the debt. I kept thinking if I stayed useful enough, I wouldn't have to feel any of it. I have been so tired of carrying that verdict." I wiped my face with a wet glove that did nothing. "You keep showing up where I fail. You keep helping what I love. I don't know what to call that except mercy." For a long stretch, I heard only creak and sleet and my own breathing settling. He held my gaze, then lowered his head that small, respectful degree I had come to recognize, not accepting praise, not refusing it, simply acknowledging what had been spoken. I told myself this couldn't be real, and even as the old sentence rose, another one stood beside it. Real is what carries weight when you put your life on it. This did. Dale came up beside me and spoke low, eyes still across the water. "You want me to pretend I didn't see that?" "No," I said. "I want you to tell it plain if anyone asks." He gave one short nod. "Plain then. We were in trouble. He helped. That's the truth." Mrs. Hanley, wrapped in my spare blanket, looked at me with wet lashes and a crooked smile. "Father, I'm too old to be shocked into silence, but I can keep a sacred thing quiet when quiet is kinder." By full dark, we had everyone up to the chapel lane, vehicles abandoned until thaw, bodies warmed by stove heat and bad coffee. I called county dispatch with exact coordinates for the failed approach and got the expected answer. Crews delayed, roads prioritized by medical access. Stay put if possible. Outcome noted, no surprise. Dale called 2 deacons with chains and shovels, and between them they got Mrs. Hanley home and stayed to light her backup heater. I stayed at the chapel with Amos, feeding the stove every 40 minutes while ice clicked against the windows like thrown rice. Close to midnight, when the storm finally eased from rattle to drip, I stepped into the fellowship hall to check the pantry corner and stopped. By the chapel stove door, stacked straight and square, sat a shoulder-high column of dry cedar rounds, bark clean, cut ends pale and fresh, enough to carry us through the freeze if we burned smart. No tracks I could trust on the refrozen mud by the threshold. Just one bent alder limb at about my shoulder height near the pine line, still swaying faintly in the afterwind. I laughed once through tired tears. "You're better at logistics than half my council," I said to the dark beyond the door, then shook my head at myself for joking with the trees again. Amos walked to the threshold, sat, and watched the cedars with that same calm expectancy. We stayed there a long minute. No tone came from the pines this time. No movement I could separate from branch and shadow. He had done what he came to do. Just before dawn, the eastern sky lightened to ash blue over the ridge, and the storm line broke. I carried one cedar round inside, set it by the stove, and felt a steadiness settle in me that had nothing to do with certainty. He withdrew the way he always had, without drama, without claim, without asking to be believed. The creek still ran hard. The bridge still needed rebuilding. Widowmaker Winter still had weeks left in it. But no one in my parish lost heat that night. No one was swept downstream, and for the first time since my brother died, I did not wake feeling sentenced. I stood in that dawn light until my fingers hurt around the cedar round, then set it by the stove and started the day like there were still tasks that could be finished by effort. Dale came back up the lane an hour later in borrowed chains, his beard white with frozen breath, and together we walked down to the creek approach with shovels on our shoulders. The deadfall crib held. Water shoved hard beneath it, but the bridge no longer rolled underfoot. On the near bank we found 3 broad prints preserved in crusted mud where shade had kept the thaw off, and beside them the alder limb bent at my shoulder height, exactly where I had seen it in the dark. Dale squatted, set his glove beside one print, and looked up at me with that same stripped bare face from the night before. "Plain truth still stands," he said. "I don't need anyone else to agree for it to stand." By Tuesday afternoon, County Roads posted a partial reopening, and dispatch called me back about the failed approach report. Same woman I had spoken to in the storm, tired voice, efficient cadence. "Father Ford, we got your coordinates and the follow-up from Mercer. Crew installed temporary barriers and flagged the crossing as restricted foot traffic only. Full repair waits on flow drop. Appreciate the early call." I thanked her and gave a list of households still needing passable access. She read each address back to me and said they'd prioritize medical routes first. That evening, Warden Klein finally made it up the lane in a mud-splashed rig. I handed him the 2 feed sacks of old snare wire I'd pulled and the broken lengths from the stump, tagged in a grocery bag with location and date. He logged it all in his clipboard, then looked toward the cedar stand and said, "You did right clearing this. Could have gone bad for dogs and deer." He never argued me into another explanation, and I never argued him out of his. The first clear Sunday after the storm break, I walked out to the confessional bench early with Amos trotting easy beside me and found the stone cross pattern laid there one final time. Same careful center line, same river-smooth grey. I knelt and touched both stones, then set one in my coat pocket and left the other where it was until after service. I waited longer that day than made practical sense. Ravens called from the ridge, ordinary and noisy again. Deer crossed the lower field at noon and never paused. No chest-deep tone came from the pines. No movement separated from shadow. And by the time my coffee cooled, I understood the quiet had changed shape. He had withdrawn the way he had arrived, with intention, without demand. Amos lay with his chin on my boot and watched the cedars one full hour before, sighing and closing his eyes, as if even he knew the waiting now belonged to memory more than expectation. 3 days later, we started roof work, Not a committee plan, not a drawn-out fundraiser, just 12 parish folks with ladders, harnesses, tar paper, salvaged sheets of metal, and the kind of stubborn cheer people bring when winter fails to beat them. Dale ran measurements from the ground. Mrs. Hanley handed up screws from a coffee can and scolded anyone who skipped gloves. Irene and May sat under a pop-up awning with a camp stove, serving thick soup and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I worked the east seam with my knuckles scraped and my shoulders burning and felt, for once, not like I was holding the whole parish alone, but like I had finally stepped back into the line with everybody else. At lunch, Walt Givens stood beside me at the tailgate, looking toward the pines beyond the fellowship hall. "You see him again?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded once, eyes still on the trees. He never added another word, and he never needed to. By the second week of January, the cedar rounds were halfway down and still dry at the core, stacked so square they burned clean and steady with almost no coaxing. No one in our call list dropped below safe heat that month. We proved it house by house. I kept making rounds with pantry boxes, and the pantry kept filling because folks who had little brought little, and it added up. On a Sunday with roads finally open both directions, I set 2 folding tables in the fellowship hall, covered them in mismatched cloths, and put out crockpots of stew, bread, oranges, and thermoses of coffee under a cardboard sign lettered in thick marker. Nolan's table. Stay warm, eat first, talk if you want. Nobody asked me to justify the name. They just lined bowls past ladles and made room for whoever came through the door. I watched a logger, a school aide, and a widow split the last biscuit 3 ways and argue kindly about who needed it most, and something in me settled where it had been grinding for months. My father came the next Sunday and stood in the doorway like a man unsure he had the right address. We had not spoken cleanly since Nolan's funeral, only short calls about estate papers, and one hard exchange that ended in silence. He kept his hat in both hands while Amos walked up and leaned against his leg like no years had passed at all. We sat by the stove with the crossed stones on my desk between us, and he spoke first. "I blamed you because I didn't know where else to put it. I blamed me before you started." He nodded, eyes on the floor. "I should have called when I got scared about him. I should have come sooner when you did." He wiped his face once and tried a smile. "Can we stop punishing each other for not being God?" "We can," I said. "We start now." He stayed for stew, washed dishes without being asked, and hugged me at the door with one hard clap between my shoulders. The old Ford family version of an apology and a blessing in one motion. When Warden Klein returned in February to check snare sweep follow-up, I walked him to the edge of the logging spur and showed him where I had found the wire and where the broad impressions had been preserved in shade. The prints were long gone by then, worked back into mud and thaw like everything else out here. He took notes, marked the hazard removal complete, and told me crews had cleared 2 more illegal sets downstream because of the report. "You probably saved a few animals without seeing it," he said. I gave him the notebook pages I'd copied on hazard locations and kept the original journal in my desk drawer under the stone pair. Physical evidence accounted for. Practical record preserved. The asters, dried and fragile, I pressed between Nolan's old field manual pages instead of throwing them out, and every time I opened that book they smelled faintly of cold earth and smoke. By early March, the bridge at Miller's Cut reopened with 1-lane control, and a sheriff's cruiser parked there for 3 days to keep folks patient. Attendance climbed back into the 20s, then the 30s. We still held confessions at the Pine Line when weather allowed, not because we had to anymore, but because people said the place invited honesty. I kept one eye on the cedar stand each time, and each time I found only trees, fog, birds, and the ordinary rustle of living things minding their own business. I waited anyway. Some Sundays Amos sat upright and watched with that old calm for 10 minutes before dozing. Some Sundays he chased a squirrel and embarrassed himself in the mud. Life returned in plain increments. I cannot explain what happened that winter in any way that would satisfy a room full of experts. I can name what I saw, what I heard, what was placed and carried and built with care. I can tell you a being of astonishing size handled my old hound like a treasure, stabilized a failing crossing so my people could live through one more night, and left enough dry cedar to keep heat in a chapel that had become a refuge. I can tell you the ravens went quiet at odd moments. The deer fed unafraid at the tree line, and mercy arrived with no sermon attached. The crossed stones still sit on my desk, one from that first pattern and one from the final Sunday, and I touch them before I write homilies when grief starts talking louder than grace. The world did not get smaller or easier after that winter. It got truer, larger too, gentler than my grief had allowed.